Guys, I don't know if you know this, but the US really doesn't like Cuba. What's that? Everyone knows that. When the Cuban Revolution triumphed over a US backed fascist dictator who terrorized the population, allowed American businesses to control most of the economy, and let the mafia do whatever the fuck they wanted, it really pissed us off. Something you may not know is that in retaliation for this grave sin of defiance, the US launched a decades long terrorist campaign against the Cuban government and really the Cuban people, and started almost immediately after the revolution. But first, a quick little detour. On March 1st, 1982, a not quite demented President Ronaldo Reagan designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terror, but didn't really feel like giving a reason. It wasn't until 2 months later that the administration said, "Fine, we'll tell you why. Get off our asses. Jesus fucking Christ." He actually said that, by the way. The official reason given was that Cuba supported left-wing terrorist groups fighting against fascism in Latin America. And we really didn't appreciate that because those were our fascists that we paid for. Another, although unofficial reason, was that a key Republican voting bloc, the anti-Castro Cubans, pressured the Reagan administration into making the designation to further punish the communist government. Now, there are three interesting ironies here. The first is that the US government at the time of designation was one of the most prolific state sponsors of terror, supporting right-wing terrorists all over Latin America, including the Contra death squads in Nicaragua that deliberately targeted civilians as a core part of their strategy. They were a bunch of cowards. And these were the actual terrorists that Cuba was helping the revolutionaries resist. But in the upside down, fighting against US-sponsored terrorism is itself terrorism. And now the US is supporting the terrorist state of Israel and its starvation and genocide of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. The second irony is that there are a number of countries, like Saudi Arabia, that support terrorist groups, and yet somehow didn't make it on this super special list of meanies. And ironically, or maybe not ironically, the same year Cuba made the list, a guy named Saddam Hussein was taken off the list. Up until 1990, Hussein was a strong ally of the US by acting as a counterweight to our mortal enemy, Iran. Oh yeah, and we also sold him chemical weapons that he used to slaughter the Kurds. And those same weapons were used as a pretext for the US invasion of Iraq. So that's pretty cool, right? Basically, the state sponsor of terror list is a giant fucking joke. It's political. If you do what we like, don't worry about it. You can support terrorism, it's fine. But if you don't do what we like, oh fuck, you might go on the list. And the third irony is that for 20 years prior to the state sponsor of terror designation, and a long time after, the US was directly and indirectly involved in terrorist attacks against Cuba that killed thousands and destroyed civilian infrastructure. The projection is absolutely mind-blowing. In January 1959, after Castro rose to power, ousting US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, the Eisenhower administration immediately started scheming on how to overthrow the new Cuban government. Castro pretty quickly traveled to the US and tried to establish diplomatic relations, however, he was rebuffed. Later that month, Castro gave a speech condemning US support for Batista and every other Latin American dictator, and now its attempt to sabotage the revolution. Castro said that the US started a campaign against the people of Cuba because they want to be free not just politically, but economically as well. A campaign against the people of Cuba because they have become a dangerous example for all America. And he was not wrong. Throughout the first year of the revolution, the Cuban government began to nationalize farmland, among other industries. At the time, foreign businesses owned 75% of the fertile land in Cuba. So Castro offered to purchase the land, and every foreign landowner, except the American ones, agreed. In October 1959, US military aircraft taking off from Florida bombed Cuban sugar mills in the Pinar del Rio and Camagüey provinces. The Cuban government tried to buy airplanes from the UK to defend themselves from US aggression, but the deal fell through once the US found out and told Britain to back off. I guess the Cuban government didn't have the right to defend itself. In January 1960, Cuba took 70,000 acres of land held by US sugar companies that refused to sell. One of these landowners was the infamous United Fruit Company, which had connections in the CIA and State Department that they used to overthrow the democratically elected president of Guatemala. So you know shit was about to go down. And it did. In response, the US sent military bombers disguised as counter-revolutionary Cuban aircraft. The planes dropped napalm bombs on oil refineries and sugarcane fields, and a week later dropped 4 bombs on Havana. Not long after that, more US bombs were dropped on cane fields and sugar mills. After repeatedly being attacked by the Northern Giant, Cuba thought if the US didn't want to be friends and will probably continue attacking us, we should ask the only other country that could defend us. And that country was obviously the Soviet Union. Cuba established diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union in May, although military assistance wouldn't begin until a year later. On March 17, 1960, the Eisenhower administration made the official yet secret decision to destroy Cuba and overthrow the Castro government. Earlier that month, La Cubra, a French vessel carrying munitions purchased from Belgium, exploded in Havana harbor. Over 100 people were killed and 300 badly injured. It was one of the most deadliest terror attacks against the people of Cuba. The US, of course, knew about the shipment and tried to get the Belgians to back out of the arms deal, but failed. But that wasn't going to stop the home of the brave and the land of the free. Before the ship's final destination in Havana, it made a stop in Miami, Florida, where it stayed for 3 whole days. Now, it's important to know that Miami was a hotbed of anti-Castro terrorist groups, and the US allowed them to operate with impunity and also supported, funded, and trained them. The terrorists who planted the bombs were clever. They planted 2 bombs timed to go off 30 minutes apart. The first blast was the weaker of the 2 and was meant to attract people who would investigate and help anyone who might be injured. And it worked. Hundreds of people came to the site of the explosion, including Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and his brother Raul. And that's when the second bomb exploded. Many thought an atomic bomb had detonated because the sky had turned black. Not only did a lot of people die, but Old Havana, a nearby neighborhood, was severely damaged. 90% of the windows had been blown out, and many of the homes had extensive damage. To this day, we don't know exactly who planned and executed the bombing of La Cubra, but we do know that CIA agent Colonel J.C. King and counter-revolutionary leader Rolando Rojas knew about the arms shipment and the various ports it stopped at. And J.C. King was actually involved in the planning of the Bay of Pigs invasion. So that's not sus as fuck. The evidence is circumstantial, but it clearly points to US involvement. Plus, the CIA and State Department refused to declassify any documents related to the bombing, which you would definitely do if you were innocent, right? Fast forward through some more US-sponsored terrorist attacks, and we have Kennedy, a rabid anti-communist, defeat the very attractive Richard Nixon in the 1960 election. JFK claimed that Nixon, the VP of Dwight Eisenhower, and also a rabid anti-communist, was not doing enough to fight the spread of communism. That's pretty bold, Jack. While terrorist attacks continued for several months, something bigger and more coordinated had been brewing. An invasion force of Cuban exiles loyal to the Batista regime, known as Brigade 2506, were being trained by the CIA in Guatemala. The Cuban government had found out, but Guatemala denied any involvement and immediately cut off diplomatic relations with Cuba. Because that's what you do when you've done nothing wrong. The US also trained exiles in Louisiana and, you guessed it, Florida. In mid-April 1961, a not yet headless JFK initiated the Bay of Pigs invasion that had originally been planned under the Eisenhower administration. And it was a total disaster for the US. Because Cuba had found out about the plan, Castro armed the entire population and trained them in basic military tactics to defend the country against a possible invasion. Brigade 2506 got its ass kicked by Cuban forces so badly that US Air Force backup was called off and left them stranded on the island. It was a complete and total embarrassment for the US, and during the invasion, Kennedy and other top officials were denying that the US was doing anything nefarious in Cuba. Despite the Bay of Pigs invasion being a total disaster for the US, that wasn't going to stop us from further punishing the Cuban people. We're overachievers in that way. In August of 1961, the CIA helped spread a rumor throughout Cuba that the government was going to take away children from their parents and raise them in communist indoctrination camps. This was known as Operation Peter Pan, and 14,000 children were sent unaccompanied to the U.S. between 1961 and 1963. The Catholic Church in both Cuba and the U.S. was the primary actor in Operation Peter Pan. They originally spread the rumor from a CIA-sponsored radio station called Radio Swan, broadcasting from Honduras. But the church went further and knocked on doors of mostly middle-class families to scare them into sending their children abroad. Some were even told that if they didn't give their children to the government, they would be thrown in jail for 15 years or disappeared. They preyed on the fears of wealthier Cuban families who were already frightened by the changes made by the Castro government. Of course, the Cuban government had no desire to take away parental authority, but that didn't matter, and the propaganda ended up being very effective. And it was straight up psychological terrorism for both parents and their kids. Many of the children ended up in Catholic orphanages, and some, although not all, were emotionally, physically, and sexually abused. And the U.S. helped speed up the process by giving I-20 student visas to the Catholic Church, who would use them to get the children into the States. This was a blatant violation of American immigration laws at the time. Of course, the U.S. government tried to spin the operation as a humanitarian effort. That's pretty laughable on its face, especially since the operation was based on a lie. But there was also an incident in the 1980s when the UN High Commissioner for Refugees asked the State Department for help reuniting Cuban families that were torn apart by the operation. The State Department basically said, "Go fuck yourself." So no, the US clearly did not have good intentions ripping families apart. As you probably know, we actually love doing that kind of thing. On November 30th, 1961, JFK, who still has his head by the way, authorized an ambitious terrorist campaign against Cuba. It was called Operation Mongoose, which, sadly, I have to admit is a pretty cool name. The operation was run by the CIA with the help of RFK Jr.'s dad, also known as RFK. After the Bay of Pigs embarrassment suffered by the poor JFK administration, they decided to switch gears from direct regime change to economic sabotage. Operation Mongoose was designed to instigate an anti-communist revolution in which the Cuban people would overthrow Castro. Spoiler alert, they did not. An anti-Castro terrorist group called Alpha 66 carried out some of the attacks against Cuba under the operation. They attacked cargo ships with Cuban products like oil and sugar. They attacked hotels, killing Cuban civilians and Soviet advisors. Although some of Alpha 66 activities weren't sanctioned by the CIA, they were allowed to operate from Miami and were initially trained and funded by the CIA. The biggest terrorist plot planned under Operation Mongoose was an attack on the Matahumba copper mine. The CIA tried to bomb the copper mine 3 times and failed for various reasons. These failed attempts occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy said that Cuba had no reason to defend itself from U.S. aggression. Absolutely hilarious. On the 4th try, they finally succeeded and ended up killing hundreds of mine workers as an added bonus. Despite some major successes, Operation Mongoose 2 was a failure, at least in the eyes of the Kennedy administration. Apparently, it didn't do enough to wreck Cuba's economy to instigate Castro's downfall. RFK even complained that the CIA didn't plan large enough attacks, so the operation was eventually dissolved. But that didn't mean the terrorism would stop. A number of anti-Castro terrorist groups were allowed by the US to base their operations in Miami, Florida. Earlier, I mentioned one of the most notorious, Alpha 66. However, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK pulled back and the CIA funding for these groups dried up. But that didn't stop them from committing acts of terror both in Cuba and the United States. These groups were disillusioned by the failures of the CIA to depose Fidel Castro and took matters into their own hands. Attacks on defenseless villages, fishing boats, movie theaters, and volunteers teaching farmers to read killed hundreds of innocent Cubans. Of course, this was all done in the name of freedom and democracy. There are many more examples of terrorism, from airline bombings to bioterrorism, that were perpetrated against Cuba. And if I told you about every single one, this video would probably be 5 hours long. The point is that the US trained, funded, and gave refuge to terrorist groups with the hopes of regime change in Cuba. I can't think of a more obvious example of a state sponsor of terror. Now, you'll notice that I didn't mention the many failed assassination attempts against Castro carried out by the CIA and Cuban exiles. And that's because most people are at least vaguely aware of that. It's become somewhat of a joke in the US, strangely. To be fair, it is an embarrassment to the CIA and probably added to US animosity towards Cuba. But I mean, imagine if some other country tried to murk our president an obscene number of times. What would we do in response? We would probably just nuke them, right? But the US is the world hegemonic power, and it can do bullshit like that and get away with it. I also didn't mention the embargo, which, while devastating to the Cuban economy, doesn't really meet the definition of terrorism. People like to hold up Cuba as an example of socialism failing miserably. But if Castro was destined to destroy Cuba with his socialist policies, why was it necessary for the US to sabotage and terrorize the country for decades? Really, the US wanted to sabotage any attempt to break away from the capitalist order that it dominated, rather than let it play out and potentially succeed. We couldn't have any country in our hemisphere provide a positive example of any system that didn't spell out American domination. Now, very quickly before I end this video, I'm not saying that Fidel Castro was the perfect leader, or that he never did anything wrong or made serious errors. But maybe now his rule can be seen in the context of near constant US aggression that should absolutely earn us a spot on someone's state sponsor of terror list. Thanks guys for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, which I know you did, please like, subscribe, comment, and if you're able to, please consider donating using the links below. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.